Welcome to another episode of Jive Talk. Today, I've got a guest who needs a little introduction. Bronze Age Pervert, a renowned author and internet troll, and an admirer of ancient aesthetics. Welcome on the show, Bap.
Thank you for having me on, Tom. It's a pleasure to talk to you again.
And to you, I was a guest on your excellent podcast, Caribbean Rhythms, a couple of years ago, I think it was. And it's about time we get you on here on Jive Talk to have a talk about what I think is very central to your ethos, including your first book. Bronze Age Mindset.
Yes.
Obviously, the title itself reveals that there is a historical basis to the philosophy you espouse, but also on your podcast, Caribbean Rhythms, you frequently you talk about areas of particularly ancient history, but sometimes more recent history as well.
Yes.
So I'd like to know a bit just about what first.
Well, I remember even maybe 12, 13, maybe you also have similar memories from even your earliest boyhood. Maybe you've always believed more or less the things you believe now. For me, that's always been the case. And I look back history, examples of human greatness. I was amazed when I read ancient stories, especially from ancient Greece, Rome. Then I read some of Viking sagas when my teens. But the amazing feats of the great men of antiquity, as told, for example, in Plutarch, Parallel Lives, it was just so awfully different from everyone I knew around me. I don't know if people understand that before internet, it's not even before internet, whatever, in the early 2000s, but before, let's say, 2010, 2011, it was almost impossible, at least in the United States, to meet anyone who thought like me. I really never met anyone in real life who thought like me. And it was only in reading historical that I saw examples, historical epics, stories, histories of antiquity from Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, etc., that I saw examples of human spirit and totally different way of seeing the world. And it is in that's been my primary inspiration and focus. I look at history as a way to take inspiration. How can and I don't mean for myself or for you or for people we know, but in general, going forward, how can possibilities of human greatness be reborn in our time? This my primary focus in looking at history, because in our time, possibilities of action and as well freedom of thought, ideas, increasingly constrained. And now it seems there is a change, but I think the recent what happened on X or Twitter, or the recent elevation of the recent liberation from censorship, let's say, is illusory and temporary. And you still need to look to antiquity, to the Renaissance and such. Those two eras, for me in particular, were important to see a different type of man is possible, a different type of life. And that's been my primary interest in history.
It's interesting you bring up the Renaissance, because that was a time, although it's seen as a time of progress, of progression and a change in Western civilization's direction, it's also a time of looking back, of rediscovering the past through history.
Yes.
And I suppose that's sort of what you're advocating for. And it's when you talk about rediscovering great men, it's a cliche to say, Caesar was inspired by Alexander and Napoleon was inspired by Caesar. So it's clear that great men are often drawn to the greatness of the past as an inspiration for how to go forwards.
Yes.
So when does that sort of looking to the past become a conservatism, or a kind of inertia or static conservatism that prevents the dynamism of a vital civilization?
Well, I'm glad you bring up the Renaissance. It's a perfect example of what we're talking about, because let's say you pick up Machiavelli at the beginning of his discourses. He says something like, a lot of people are trying to copy, and not copy especially, but revitalize, bring back ancient forms of seeing and thinking in the arts, and trying to reproduce ancient sculptures, ancient visual arts, and even improve upon them. But nobody's doing it in the realms of morality and politics. They're not trying to take lessons from the remote antiquity and apply to our own time. And that's what I'm going to do in this book, The Discourses. I will study Livy's history of Rome, and I'll see how what lessons we can take from it to our time, what inspiration we can take for not just how to live your own life as an individual. That's not, I think, primarily his concern. 21 lessons from Homer about how to improve your interior design business. This is not Machiavelli's concern. It's more, how can we found new modes and orders, a new foundation for a new type of state, a new type of life, and be inspired by what happened with Rome in that case, for example. So I think that is a right approach to history. On the other hand, there is what you just referred to, using the weight of the past. It bears down on you so much that you can't create anymore, which is why, since we talk about Italy now, you go to Italy, almost all the great new innovations of, let's say, since 1800, 1900 happened in the north, in Piedmont, in Turin. That was actually the place from which Italy, the Italian state, was created and united in the 1860s. And you go to Piedmont, you go to Turin, it feels in many ways very modern. I was walking around the streets. Nietzsche loved this city. I was thinking he must love, if he sees Chicago or New York, it looks like a very prosperous 19th century industrial city. And an Italian friend describes this to me, says, in Turin and Piedmont is where the weight of the past was least felt. In the rest, you walk around, you see these things that were built 2,000 years ago or more, and you say, how can I ever equal this? And it crushes your spirit in some way, whereas all the innovations seem to come out of Piedmont. Of course, you could say they took inspiration from the past too, but it wasn't in this inertia sense. And if you'd like to talk about this some more, the problem of history in regards to conservatism versus, let's say, futurism, I think Nietzsche has some quite profound thoughts on this. I don't know if you want to go down this.
Yes, I would like to. I think that's an interesting thing about the point about Piedmont and like the fact that it's a source of innovation and it was modern. I think, although I'm sure Piedmont has its share of historical marvels as well, but
sure,
the descent of Nietzsche into Turin reminds me a lot of his own description, like of the character of Zarathustra descending from that mountain, because he did come down out of the mountains, right, into in a state of confusion. He wasn't in his best state by then, breaking down and crying and hugging a horse, allegedly.
Yes.
But what we could talk about that Nietzsche thing, but I also wanted to pick up on what you're saying about your second book and why that will focus on Livy's history of Rome. Like, how is that going to be the starting point?
So I'm sorry, I should clarify. I don't know if there was maybe the attack internet system. I love Livy, but I meant that Machiavelli's book, his discourses, and not the Prince, but the Prince too. But in the maybe I'm confusing the introductions of the two. In one of them, but in the discourses, he starts saying, I will it's a discourses on Livy's history of Rome. But if you read, he's not doing like a book report or textual analysis. He has different short chapters, aphorisms really, in which he looks back at Livy's history and he combines it with recent Florentine and Italian history and European history, and he draws lessons from them. I'm very interested in this. My second book, that's a different matter. It will hopefully come out, I think it will come out later this year, hopefully by end of summer, beginning of autumn, and it's different. It's not about this. But I was referring to Machiavelli's approach to history, which I very much agree with. And look, since we're talking about this, there is a famous Nietzsche passage. I will read a little bit of Nietzsche, if you don't mind, because it bears directly on what we're talking about. In his book, Twilight of the Idols, there is, it's called Whispered to the Conservatives. He says, what was not known formerly, what is known or might be known today, a reversion, a return in any sense or degree is simply not possible. We physiologists know that. Yet all priests and moralists have believed the opposite. They wanted to take mankind back, to screw it back to a former measure of virtue. Morality was always a bed of Procrustes. Even the politicians have aped the preachers of virtue at this point. Today, too, there are still parties whose dream it is that all things might walk backwards like crabs, but no one is free to be a crab. Nothing avails. One must go forward, step by step further into decadence. That is my definition of modern progress. One can check this development and thus dam up degeneration, gather it and make it more vehement and sudden. One can do no more. I've always found this. And remember, this is the thinker. Say what you will about the modern interpretations, contemporary interpretations of him, but no one denied that, let's say, the European, what you'd call hard right, far right, from 1900 to 1940 was almost entirely Nietzschean, a spiritual creation of Nietzsche. They constantly referred to him, went back to him. So that's a hard right thinker saying this. What does that mean? I agree with that. He was opposed somewhat to although sympathetic, he thought that conservatives, reactionaries, really very much went the wrong way. And his criticism actually of Plato and the Socratic moral schools in antiquity is similar to what I just read now. His main criticism of them is that they were kind of conservative, reactionary antiquarians in their own time, and in an age of, let's say, coming apart of decadence and degeneration of the ancient Greek world, they were trying to reestablish or save an earlier version of virtue, and that didn't work. In fact, he thinks it had long-term catastrophic effects. But anyway, that passage I just read, I don't know what you think about that. I think
it's interesting. Yeah, I think there's a point to be made connected back to what we were talking about the Renaissance before, that I can't remember which philosopher I was reading it, but they argued, and I think correctly, that a lot of the Western ideas of the ancient world, the classical world, the Greek and Rome, is based on assumptions during the Renaissance, which underlie humanism and a lot of modern liberal ideas, and it sort of projects onto the ancient world a sort of kind of idealized version of them that wasn't really what they were about, because it was more about rejecting some of the prevailing norms of medieval Europe and then going for the antithesis and assuming that the ancient world was this antithesis. But I think it might be Guénon who I'm thinking of, who wrote this argument. But I think it's true that there was much more continuity with the medieval and the classical than is generally assumed. Yes. And a lot of the idea of although there were people say this free energetic sexuality depicted in artwork, in the classical artwork, a sculpture, is just not really present in the High Middle Ages as much. But there were, I think you've said on your podcast, the average medieval person was pretty hypersexual. There was a lot of sexuality in medieval Europe, and people were probably fucking more than they are now, to be honest. So I think there's some misunderstandings there.
One of my favorite things in regards to that, I knew some English friends who maybe we talked about this, the idea of merry old England that was actually done away with by the Puritan takeover of England. But before then, the English had a very different type of morality in life. And one of my favorite details is about the beer issue. You know about this, the fact that before before the Puritans, the English drank ale and it was flavored with gruit. I don't know how you can pronounce that. With
gruit,
a mix
fruits
of herbs. Yes, a mix of herbs, heather primarily, but other herbs. And beer was seen as a stimulant. People had, I won't say orgies, but they had kind of jolly medieval rollicking parties. And then the Puritans are the ones who introduced from the continent the use of hops. Why? Because hops make beer bitter and unpleasant, and at the same time, they're a soporific. So beer now is associated with calming you and putting you to sleep or something, but before it was a stimulant,
Indeed.
So
Yeah, it came from Germany. The hops came in from, it was a German foreign custom. In England, it was never a native thing until, as you say, it was like Protestant connections with Germany.
Yes.
But I know it may be interesting to some. There's a related tidbit. When coffee was first introduced, some of the first coffee houses in Europe, besides Vienna, were in England. And they were copying, the Vienna copied them from the Turks. But the previous to coffee, like the main drink had been ale that you would drink at breakfast or whatever. It would invigorate you. And that stage in history, ale brewing had been dominated by women, actually. So it was the alewives were like had cornered the market, and they released propaganda saying that coffee makes a man as barren as the deserts whence it came. And implying that beer made you virile, and quite the reverse.
Yes, I think this may be true. Oh God, I'm complete addict to coffee, but I'd like to stop. But what you were saying earlier about the Renaissance, it made me think. This man Palladio, the architect. Very much today, when you see people attack modern decadence, modern art, modern so on, and then they go and say, "Oh, we should be reproducing older classical styles, which are beautiful," by which they mean really 19th century or late 19th century styles, which were new at the time, by the way. But Palladio didn't. He looked around. He was, let's say, displeased with general run of architecture of his time, and he took inspiration from antiquity. But if you look at his buildings, they're not just reproductions of ancient Roman or Greek buildings. He innovated. So this, I think, perfect use. You look back to the past, you see the beautiful ancient Greek, ancient Roman architecture, but you don't reproduce it. You reinterpret it for your own time. You revitalize it. That is, to me, the wonderful looking back at history, the example of Palladio and the arts. The same can be done, of course, in politics and morality. It's not, I'm going to role play and reenact and copy and be a slave to history,
Yeah, I think the pre-Raphaelites are sort of like that, like the arts and craft movement of Victorian times, which it was medieval-esque, but it wasn't like, I mean, the pre-Raphaelite painting doesn't look like a medieval painting. It's just inspired by it, and it takes it in any direction. Some people will still say it's kitsch, but I think that's a bit too critical. I don't think it's kitsch. I think it's a very interesting direction. And I mean, the neo-Gothic in architecture, I really love it. That is a bit more derivative, but like the Houses of Parliament in England, amazing building, and in Canada and North America, there was a lot of neo-Gothic, and it was basically just sort of building Gothic architecture from 800 years previously, but on a larger scale. Which is a new interpretation. Like a skyscraper with Gothic elements is not purely medieval, but it has that link to the past as aesthetics, which I think would be natural. Would you agree?
Yes, of course. There is a long line of cultural commentators from. Everyone knows about Spengler, but Paglia makes a similar point that the skyscrapers are a natural evolution of the medieval European Faustian spirit, and they even look like that would be a wonderful re-update example of how history can revitalize and inspire new creation. But it is this, to go back to your initial question, it is this that concerned me. How can new modes of life be reintroduced in our time when, yes, you look around, everybody's a low man, everybody has petty desires. How do you escape that? And how can preconditions for the production of culture in the broadest sense, the arts, literary production and so on, how can it happen today? Not just as a preservation of the past, but how can history inspired new creation today? This has been my concern. And I need to emphasize that there is a way that you can use, unfortunately, examples of ancient greatness to smother and suffocate actually the possibility of new creation. And Nietzsche has a passage about this. It's not too long, but maybe a couple of paragraphs. Please. Can I read?
Yeah.
And this is from his essay that I recommend for anyone interested in these questions on the use and abuse of history for life, where he talks about 3 approaches to history. How can he says history is not really a science. It is something that is always in the service of some agenda or some use today. And he talks about 3 approaches: the critical, the antiquarian, and the monumental. And we can get into these if you want, but the monumental is kind of what I've been referring to. You look to the past for inspirations of human greatness or artistic or philosophical greatness. And that can be great if it's used to inspire and spur on new things. But here he gives an example of how it can be used to smother and suffocate. And it always depends on who uses it. Here, I will read now. Let us take the simplest and most frequent example. If we imagine to ourselves uncultured and weakly cultured natures, energized and armed by monumental cultural history, against whom will they now direct their weapons? Against their hereditary enemies, the strong cultural spirits, and thus against the only ones who are able to learn truly from that history, that is, for life, and to convert what they have learned into a higher practice. For them, the path will be blocked and the air darkened if people dance around a half-understood monument of some great past or other, like truly zealous idolaters, as if they wanted to state, see, this is the true and real culture. Why concern yourself with those who are transforming themselves and wanting something new? Apparently, this dancing swarm possesses even the privilege of good taste, so-called. For the creative person always stands at a disadvantage with respect to someone who merely looks on and does not put his own hands to work. Just as, for example, the political know-it-all has always been wiser, more just, more considerate than the ruling statesman. But if we want to transfer into the realm of art, the use of plebiscites and of numerical majority, and as it were, to require the artist to stand in his own defense before the forum of aesthetically inert types, then we can take an oath in advance that he will be condemned, not in spite of, but precisely because of the fact that his judges have solemnly proclaimed the canon of monumental art, that is, in accordance with the official explanation of art, which in all ages has had effects. Whereas for the judges, all art which is not yet monumental, because it is contemporary, is always first unnecessary, second without pure tendencies, and third lacking that authority of history. On the other hand, their instinct tells them that art can be struck dead by art. The monumental is definitely not to rise up once more. And for that, their instinct uses precisely what has the authority of the monumental from the past. So they are connoisseurs of art because they generally like to get rid of art. They behave as if they were doctors, while basically they are concerned with mixing poisons. So they develop their languages and their taste in order to explain in their discriminating way why they so persistently disapprove of all the nourishing artistic food offered to them. For they do not want greatness to arise. Their method is to say, see, greatness is already there. In truth, this greatness that is already there is of as little concern to them as what is emerging. Of that, their life bears witness. Monumental history is the theatrical costume in which they pretend that their hate for the powerful and the great of their time is a fulfilling admiration for the strong and the great of past times. In this, through disguise, they invert the real sense of that method of historical observation into its opposite. Whether they clearly know it or not, they certainly act as if their motto were, let the dead bury the living. What do you think of that? You like that? Tom, your mic is muted.
Sorry, which book is that from?
That's from an early essay from the 1870s, I think, on the use and abuse of history for life.
Yeah, I've not read that of Nietzsche's. It does sound, it's describing a kind of a cope where people project onto someone, an achieving people, like a fault by comparing them to an idealized past that's just a way of undermining the greatness of the present. That's quite interesting. In your work, you have used like you've used as like a representation of this like negative history, certain civilizations, including Neolithic Europe and China. China,
Yes.
you've mentioned several times. So
Yes.
this is you see as a danger to the philosopher, or to as a general threat to Western culture, or as at the present this mode of long-housed civilization.
Um, well, yes, I think history can be used in various ways with various excuses to retard the possibility of freedom, of human greatness, of progress, and certainly China, in its mostly its desultory history, has represented this. That's my main objection. I don't care as much about the modern Chinese state and so on, but it's what it has been in history and so on. But yes, more than just a danger to West or Western culture, which is not in a good condition right now. But it's a danger to this. It's the danger to possibility of human greatness and human action when it's used in the way I just described now. Which, by the way, the left has its other faults, which we can talk about in a moment. They want to debunk the past examples of human greatness, also in order to say that it's not possible today. So they go to Napoleon or any other, again, out of a sense of envy or spite over the possibility that a higher form of human life is possible. And through that means, a critical history means they want to say that, it never really existed. The great men of the past were also crooks or wankers or didn't really exist and so on. But what I just described and read now is actually very common among a certain type of conservative, a certain type of traditionalist, and it's extremely common, unfortunately, among the Philistines who are promoted online now as so-called dissident populists and so on. It's people who, what he says, it's a theatrical costume. They put on the image of history, the weight. They don't really appreciate it. They only want to use it as a weapon against the possibility of any further modern innovation.
Mm-hmm. Because it makes them feel inferior to know that a man can become great. That phenomenon is also in Hollywood with the recent biography of Napoleon by that Scottish chap, Ridley Scott. Yeah.
Yes, the dominant mode of the West, I think, is still leftist, and so they employ that different path. They say all great men of the past are secretly whatever, sexual perverts or crooks or thieves, or in some cases they would even say didn't really exist, or this kind of thing.
Yes, it's interesting. The individual as a great man is so threatening. I wanted to also, talking of individuals who shape history, like go to a point that you've made in the second to last podcast you uploaded,
Yes.
which echoes Nietzsche's criticisms of Plato.
Yes.
Because Plato is so important, such an extraordinarily important man for understanding all Western culture and many of the things that are happening all over the world. And I think you can attribute to him everything from Christianity to communism and even fascism, to some extent, have their roots in his thoughts.
Yes.
But you said Plato represents a new level on which the spiritual struggle for the future takes place. His introduction of his thought, and Platonism by extension, and that this was the start of a new view of man as an object of political, moral contention and ambition, which is kind of like the sort of transition. Some people would argue like the transition to the total war of the early 20th century was because of the death of God, like Nietzsche would call death of God, and like the sudden reframing of man as like the subject of like this like control of ideological control, like, that you want to win over masses in this way. But certainly I think it's reasonable to extend that further back to Christianity, and from Christianity back to Plato. But maybe it's unfair to some extent to teach. I mean, how, when you said that, were you entirely against what Plato achieved, or like, do you
No.
think that this was an inevitability anyway because
Yes. I think
Buddha and Zarathustra were going to do the same kind of thing anyway, right?
yes, I think it's simply a biological historical event in the life of any intelligent species who doesn't, let's say, stay at the level of the grass hut. Obviously, even before, let's say, 500, 400, 300 BC, there had been empires. There had been empires in Mesopotamia and Asia going back well before then. But the mode by which they existed was very different. Their self-understanding and self-justification was very different. They conquered foreigners, and they sometimes said they were doing it in the name of their gods. But you get an image of this, I think it's in Herodotus, of how the Persians saw themselves with concentric. I mean, it's the ultimate example of what you could call ethnocentrism. They saw the world in concentric circles. Anyone the farther away it got from Persia, the more inferior and irrelevant they thought such people, and they saw themselves as entitled to rule. And the empire was formed on that basis. But when you look at what happened, the event I described with Plato, which was also based, I read on that show a beautiful passage from Nietzsche's book, The Dawn, where he talks about how Plato made 3 attempts to go to Sicily. Why? Sicily and southern Italy were kind of like the America of the ancient Greek world. They had expanded a few hundred years before, let's say 700 BC, a bit before then. It was a big territorial expansion of the Greek peoples. It was enormously wealthy for its time and so on. And the cities there, Syracuse being the biggest of them, were pan-Hellenic. They were kind of cosmopolitan. It wasn't just anymore the Ionians, the Dorians, and, or separated by a lot of different types of Greeks had settled there. And so it became a pan-Hellenic Mediterranean megalopolis, Syracuse. And Plato went there with the intention to found a political moral teaching that would apply to the entire Greek world. He makes the comparison to Muhammad, what Muhammad did for the Arabs, to kind of unite the Greeks under a new, I don't even want to say religion, because that word is misunderstood today. As you know, it's a new, complete vision of life that will regulate everyday behavior and state structure and everything else. And so it could have been, he failed, but he only failed by a few historical accidents. It could have very well been that his disciple there, Dion, he could have become king, tyrant of Syracuse, and we would have seen the Platonization of the European South several centuries before it actually happened under the form of Christianity. But it would have been a kind of universal religion, political structure for the Greek race, call it what you will. And that's what I meant. It's a new, the stakes are upped considerably from what had existed before, where it was always political structures, religious structures, even were very local. This is different.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I think that the Platonism as a religion was something that what my knowledge of Platonism is, I wouldn't say I'm an expert, but it seems to develop in the Platonic Academy after Plato over time. I know that the general view of like philosophers of Britain, like experts in philosophy in the 19th century, like in the English-speaking world, was that the Neoplatonists were not real Plato. They weren't real disciples of Plato because they saw Plato at that time as like this absolute rational Anglo-style thinker, whereas the Neoplatonists were mystics who just lost their nerve and had to retreat to metaphysics. But I think that like the metaphysics is in Plato, it's clear in the Timaeus. But I think that like the actual fleshing out of it, where it becomes a dogma, is something that happened a long time later. Maybe that was not Plato's intention. I'm not sure, because he does seem more like putting it out there. These are some ideas. Whereas the Platonists are like, this is what the master, the divine Plato, who was himself inspired by the gods, has taught us. So they kind of like made him into, like, I think you used the term a Muhammad of the Hellenes, which is quite interesting.
Yes.
But I think there's some accurate, that becomes true perhaps only during the Roman period, but I'm not sure exactly when that picks off. But yeah, I also think that this kind of tendency was like, as you say, it's in the Persians and Zoroaster, and that like once you've got a kind of doctrine that you think is the absolute universal truth, then there's a tendency then to see it as your duty to enforce it on everyone else who hasn't figured it out yet. So maybe it would have happened anyway. Or would you have if you could, would you want to prevent that? But you said you think it's a necessary stage of development.
Yes, I don't think it's preventable. It's like saying, yeah, I don't. And by the way, it's not only Plato. The Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, who by Plato's time were already an established school in southern Italy and Sicily, they had a big hand in inviting Plato there to start his mission. They too, I think both Pythagoras and Plato saw themselves as possible religious prophets. Again, I would agree with you, it's not religion used as in the modern sense, but I think they did think they would become kind of like what Muhammad later became to the Arabs, but to the Greeks. And they couldn't, because the Greek world, even by the 300s, was so multifaceted in the variety of its individual types. They were so egotistical. That was both their strength and their weakness, that they would never accept the imposition of such a system on themselves. So if you look at Plato's laws, everyone read the Republic, but the laws, which, by the way, the only modern state, in fact, the only state I'm aware of that was, let's say, the modern state that was founded on the laws is the Iranian Islamic Republic. Quite self-consciously, Khomeini based it on structures that are even institutions from the laws that were reproduced in Islamic form in Iran. I think,
So the Greeks beat the Persians in the long run anyway.
Yeah.
Just via the medium of Islam, finally,
Yes.
The Greeks beat the Persians.
Well, it's it's very compatible in the sense that the laws, it regulates aspects of daily life in the same way that if you look at Shiite clerics, go on any Shiite forum, it's always, sir, can I go to the bathroom in this form or this other form? It reads very much like, people throw the word Talmudic. That's what rabbinic commentary is like too. But it's already in the laws, that type of minute regulation of everyday life. In the service of something greater. And I don't think, by the way, that Plato or Pythagoras themselves thought that this political or religious posture was the final truth, but they thought it would be in service to the final truth. And
they were trying to move towards, they believed that it was achievable to understand an absolute truth, including thereby an absolute morality, even if they didn't actually espouse one.
Yes, it's not that they necessarily believed like someone like Muhammad that God spoke to them and gave them this legal code that the Greeks and in some way mankind would then have to follow. It's more like they just thought this would be good. This moral code would be good for the Greeks or mankind to follow. A similar point, by the way, is made by Alexander Kojev when he says that something entirely new happened with Aristotle and Alexander, which again, same provenance from Socrates, right, and Plato, but saying that Alexander is the first one to actually found a true universal empire based on the idea of the biological unity of mankind. Which prior to that had not been a thing. It was not even conceivable. But, he forced the Greek aristocracy to marry Persian women and did many things that we today would consider at least proto-cosmopolitan, proto-globalist. But it was founded on this new idea from Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, that the new arena of spiritual war would be the determination of what a human is, what a human is as such universally, not just for Greek or.
Yeah, well, this idea of the human is certainly revolutionary, and it causes a lot of. I mean, I think it's a philosophical concept more than biological, because right now I think a lot of like archaeogeneticists are starting getting in a bit of a tizzy about what exactly. I mean, it's not so relevant in terms of the biology of existing hominids, because there's only one. So that you can easily say, well, humans. But if there was a biological definition of a human, then it needs to exclude other hominids, and that's why they're getting a bit worried, because that would mean there were degrees of humanness, and that could even spill into the modern population. And so some people want to call Neanderthals a human, for example, and others would say no, that doesn't make any sense because it undermines the entire basis of biological taxonomy that applies to other species. Like, that's not how we would define a species in any other thing. So anyway, it is a philosophical, like a potent philosophical idea of like that united together, and things like the garden, the common descent from Adam and Eve I don't think they could really exist without that previous philosophical development. I don't know what Semitic mythology was like prior to contact with Plato, or whether Adam and Eve were just the racial ancestors of the Semites, and then they were expanded to becoming the ancestors of all mankind later on.
That's extremely interesting, and gets into a topic that we can discuss if you want. I know it's of high interest to you too, Tom, which is the history of what actually happened with the Bible and Judaism and Christianity, and after that Islam. What is their origin? I just very briefly, I think the religion of the Bible, whatever it was called, by the time of the Bible coming about, it was already a universalist cosmopolitan religion. I think that's what you're hinting at, maybe. But,
yes, I think so. I think the Judaism was already heavily Hellenized, and Platonic influence had existed there prior to Christianity, quite a while before, and also Iranized or Persianized too, like, because the Jews of Persia were so influential. I think the concept of Satan is probably lifted from Zoroastrianism. Due to the Jews in Iran. But this does sound interesting. So if you had something to say on the matter, I'd like to hear it.
I have many things to say. I'm reluctant to, because this matter is so politicized now, and we all use the word astroturfed, but anything you say on the early history of Christianity and Judaism right now immediately gets plagiarized, taken over by and co-opted and distorted by others. So I would like to write a longer thing on this to fully make the case so that it can't be distorted by others. But very briefly, I think the first time you really see something like a recognizably biblical monotheistic religion is in the Hasmonean dynasty. And
when's the Hasmonean dynasty, for those who don't know?
Well, let me go back to the beginning of it. I highly recommend for you and all of your listeners to read the Maccabees book of the Bible. It reads the beginning, the opening of it reads very, very different from the rest. It starts with saying, "And Alexander had laid low the world at his feet, and there was nothing left but Alexander," and blah, blah, blah. It goes on from there. I think that was the foundation of the Bible and of the Israelite religion as exists in the Bible. Before then, there had been a people, there had been tribes in that area, and probably King David had existed. He probably had a war god or something, but they were probably polytheistic. And around that time, I think there was a conscious attempt by the Maccabees and what came after them to found a people, to found a unified national religion based on the teaching of Plato, but inverted. And we can get into that if you want. It was an inversion of Greek Hellenism, which means just the Alexandrian world. The Bible, I think, which probably various parts of it had existed before, were compiled into a scripture, a unified national scripture at that time, and reinterpreted with Genesis, the opening probably written around then or after. Everything reinterpreted, in my opinion, as an inversion of the Greek ideal and of the Greek way of life, but with similar universalistic cosmopolitan pretensions, with the so-called Israelite or Jewish people, Hebrews, whatever you want, at the center. and it was it was a proselytizing religion. People forget this. It was Christianity.
Certainly in the Roman,
yes,
in the Roman
Judaism,
Empire, late Roman Empire.
Absolutely, it was. I think a proselytizing religion even before 0 AD. And that's something that both Jews and Christians today try to sweep under the rug,
Yeah, it does. Old Testament seems to me like it does have an obvious character of a genuine, like, native mythology of a people, traditional mythology, like including, like, their past battles and the Genesis. I mean, parts of Genesis do seem to me like an authentic Bronze Age religious origin, but then rewritten and interpreted to a to a philosophical perspective, like, due to Hellenic, specifically Platonic influence. And I know that there's kind of like a competing, in the world of late antiquity, particularly, there's like a competition to see who was actually the source of this way of life. Because I know, like, the Hebrews wouldn't like to attribute it to the Greeks. So even like the Platonist, the Jewish Platonist Philo, he said that, like, Plato learned everything from Moses, and it all came from Moses. But, like, I know you said, like, Pythagoras. I think you speak ancient Greek, so would it be Pythagoras, or to say it in the old way? But Pythagoras was he was influenced by I think it's Plutarch claimed that he was influenced by Zoroaster, even though they were, like, basically contemporaries. I don't see that's very likely. But Iamblichus says Pythagoras learned everything from the British Celts, and I'm inclined to think that's probably more true. Yeah, but that's 800 years after Pythagoras lived. So yeah, just take that with a pinch of salt. Yeah.
Well, I said all of these are possible. I mean, look, Schopenhauer says Jesus must have surely lived in India and studied with the Hindus, but the Greeks always had this kind of inferiority complex with respect to the great Near Eastern culture. So they even, Herodotus, I think they thought their gods came from Egypt, which is obviously not true, and many other things that Thales must have studied Babylonia. They always thought this. It's very interesting. They thought of themselves as heirs and looked up in awe at the great civilizations of the Near East, primarily, I think, because those civilizations had much older written historical records, actually. But the Greeks had the Dark Ages, and so they thought of themselves as newcomers. But it's amazing that they had this opinion and borrowed heavily from others, but were also the creators of a radically new culture that was very unique. So, but yeah, to get to what you're saying, I don't think it's true or whatever or relevant that Pythagoras learned from this, or that if Plato learned from Egyptians or whatever,
Yes, well, I mean, to me, it does seem possible the doctrines of Pythagoras were influenced by Egypt, but yeah, I don't consider it I don't think that means that we blame Egypt, or that, like, Plato needs to be like it's a plagiarizer of Egyptian thought or anything. It's not even certain that is the case, but it just seems like a possible vector, because the doctrine of transmigration of souls, while it did exist among the British, the native Celts, but it also existed among Slavs and Germans. But it's known to be a thing that is in Egypt, like, quite early on, and they have written records. So it's so interesting what you're saying about the importance of written records and how it has basically, like, it undermined the Greek confidence in the antiquity of its civilization, because there's a myth that the Egyptians had an argument with the Scythians about who was older, and the Scythians were illiterate, so they would have been confident in the antiquity of their culture just based on their oral traditions. Whereas at some point, maybe because of the Bronze Age, Dark Ages, the Greeks, having learned literacy, become literate, then become illiterate again, and having to become literate a second time, maybe they lost a continuity with their ancient history, which made them feel somewhat inferior to some of the cultures to the east and south who had retained, like, written, like, traditions for so long. In the same way that kind of, like, British historians in the 18th century started to claim they're descended from Phoenicians or whatever, just because they wanted to have, and even earlier they started to say they were from Trojan origins, because they wanted to have a connection to a culture with a written history in late, in the deep distant past, which it's just because of once you become literate, once you're introduced to that technology, it's hard to see the value in the previous form of information retrieval, which was the ancient songs of your people. It was sung by bards and things like that.
Yes, yes, and I think, by the way, that kind of, we need to put quotation marks about of feeling inferior or that kind of inferiority complex when you look at, oh, that other civilization must be 10,000 years old because they have records that go back to Atlantis or whatever. But at the same time, the Greeks felt that they were the natural rulers of everyone else. So it was kind of, I think, a playful thing where they look back and they freely borrow from others, but it doesn't. It's a spur to them. It's a spur to creativity, and in this sense, I want to go back a bit to what we started to talk at the beginning of show, if you don't mind, because there's in this essay of Nietzsche, The Use and Abuse of Life for History. He must have written it when he was 28 or something, but he has three types of history: critical history, antiquarian history, monumental history. He says all three can be used for the benefit of life. They can improve things, and all three can also be used for the opposite. And what you just described now, where you have a civilization that looks always to its past, and its thinkers, its scribes are always trying to preserve the past, to honor it, to honor their past, and so on. It's the ultimate example of traditionalism or conservatism. And if you don't mind, I would like to read another paragraph from Nietzsche, what he has to say about this, because it's at the same time an example of the use of history, of its great value, and of its limitations. Can I read a paragraph?
Please do.
History belongs secondly to the man who preserves and honors, to the person who with faith and love looks back in the direction from which he has come, where he has been. Through this reverence he gives thanks for his existence. While he nurtures with a gentle hand what has stood from time immemorial, he wants to preserve the conditions under which he came into existence for those who are to come after him, and so he serves life. The possession of his ancestors' household goods changes the ideas in such a soul, for those goods are far more likely to take possession of his soul. The small, limited, crumbling, and archaic keep their own worth and integrity, because the conserving and honoring soul of the antiquarian person settles on these things and there prepare for itself a secret nest. The history of his city becomes for him the history of his own self. He understands the walls, the turreted gate, the dictate of the city council, and the folk festival like an illustrated diary of his youth, and he rediscovers from himself in all this force his purpose, his passion, his opinion, his foolishness, etc. Anyway, he keeps going like that, and explains in a very beautiful way, maybe more beautiful than a conservative or a traditionalist could explain, the great use of this kind of history that you see today in traditionalists and conservatives, and in a much more hieratic state form in the ancient Oriental civilizations that we've just been talking about. But listen to what he says. But listen to what he says next about this, which is okay. He says, but how could history better serve life? How could history better serve living than by the fact that it thus links the less favored races and populations to their home region and home traditions, keeps them settled there, and prevents them from roaming around in foreign places looking for something better, and in search of that fighting competitive wars. So that sounds a bit condescending, and I think it's true. I mean, I think Nietzsche is saying history, even at its best, it's suited for unambitious, unremarkable races when it's a guide to life in this sense. Whereas the ancient Greeks were obviously very, very different from this,
Yes, that is interesting. I mean, as far as I'm aware, the actual histories that the Greeks had of themselves, none of them really go that far back. Like, they can't really place. They talk about they don't have like a coherent narrative of the introduction of like the Indo-European languages, like 4,000 years ago into that region of Greece. Yes. So so they saw themselves as like being native and indigenous to the region, but they also saw the Pelasgians as predating them, and so they had some notion that they weren't the original inhabitants of the land. But yeah, that is an interesting view. I wonder if I wonder as an Englishman sometimes whether us having a national origin myth of us taking the land coming from abroad and just seizing the land for ourselves contributed to a less static like national character that was less inclined to be confined. And so under Elizabeth I, at the first opportunity when we had the money and the means to do it, we started trying to reach our arms around the entire world.
Yes. No, that's very interesting. I think it's probably true, yes. And I think there was a similar spirit among the ancient Greeks, even if they didn't have an explicit myth like the arrival of Horst and Hengist or whatever. But they didn't have these ancient, huge national chronicles going back supposedly, 8,000 years like the Babylonians or Egyptians did. But they had something else. They had, of course, the story of the Trojan War told in Homer, but in other variations too. So this ancient raid was kind of their national story that kept getting told over and over. And there was another one, a special favorite of mine, Jason's voyage, Jason and the Argonauts. And I don't remember. Yes, I don't remember if we talked about this when you came on my show, Tom, but one of my favorite theories, alternative theories, is that the story of Jason is the story of the arrival of the Greeks, but told backwards. In other words, they remember their voyage over sea, actually from the Caucasus, but in the story of Jason, it's told backwards,
Interesting. Well, it does imply some kind of like connection, like knowledge and connection to the Caucasus, but then again, there was a civilization there worth trading with. So it might just be contemporary, knowledge of that is part of the, the world. And they were a maritime people, the Greeks. So like it isn't an especially difficult place to get to, although it is in the myth. It's an epic journey. But I don't think when you go through the Bosphorus that they actually start clashing together and smashing you or anything like that.
Yes. Well, since we're on this connection to the Caucasus, the other myth that very popular, important to the Greeks, the myth of Prometheus, is actually common, I think, not just to the Greeks, but many Aryan, Indo-European peoples also, and it's shared by some of the native peoples of the Caucasus. So in pre-Islamic Chechen culture, they have a Prometheus myth,
Interesting. I'm not aware of that, but I would also say that the problem with that Caucasus for that mythic comparison is that it's a region of lots of turmoil. The Iranic, Scythian tribes came into those regions and would have brought cultural elements into those regions, and there could be, there could be a Scythian origin rather than Chechens, the ancestors of the Chechens. But yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Prometheus has Indo-European origins because I think Loki is the same. Loki in Norse myth is the same being. Like it has a very similar end. Like he gets punished. He like challenges the gods in his disruptive behavior, and then he is tied up in the underworld and punished by an animal, and he's restrained there. As his punishment. So it seems the same.
Yes,
the same myth, and he's not exactly the same character, but. Yeah, I definitely think that there's been a long time for them to diverge. But I've said a video about what I said, like there's this Hermes and Prometheus has this relationship that parallels Loki and Odin. So I think there's something going on there, like they're two sides of the same coin or something like that. But would you like to talk more? Because I know we have a disagreement about the Caucasus and the origins of the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Maybe we don't have time to go over it here, but we can if you like.
Sure. Well, what about it specifically? I know we've talked about this before. Yes.
Well, I mean, there's the I guess it might be too much to go into now, but because we'd have to go over each of our positions first, and I haven't prepared notes or anything. But yeah, I think that personally, I think the role of the Caucasus is overstated by many because I really believe, like Anthony, that it's a steppe phenomenon, that Proto-Indo-European is a steppe phenomenon. It has contacts with cultures to the south and it's absorbing DNA from the Caucasus, but that the like the cultural phenomenon of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and the way that it disseminated is just not connected to the mountain people at all.
Yes.
Really, I think it's a steppe phenomenon. It comes from steppe warrior people and not from the Caucasus. But
I would actually agree with that, Tom. It's only a matter of there would have been different staging areas. So very quickly on what we just spoke about with the Greeks, if you look at the Southern Caucasus culture called Trialeti, I think,
yes,
although it was located by, let's say, 2000 BC or something in the Southern Caucasus, but its origins were, I think, it was part of the catacombs culture or something like that. So
yes,
they
that's
had
right.
it was a steppe culture that had moved there in relatively recent times. It was extreme warlike. Some of the earliest examples of organized combat warfare are from that region. And the case can be made, which I can try to say quickly if you want to get into it, the evidence for why I think that culture is probably the immediate predecessor of the Greeks. I'm not saying it's of the other Indo-European peoples, but I do think they went across the Black Sea and settled, or rather took over Greece, starting in about 1800 BC or then. There are many archaeological, I think, arguments that can be made for this, including the use of Cyclopean architecture there right before it comes to Greece and so on, to the Mycenaean age and so on. So, but I'm not saying that all the Indo-European peoples came from there. Similar, I remember we had an argument about the role of the Carpathians. This isn't my argument. I am taking it from Robert Drews, and he's not saying that the Carpathian Basin is, or let's say the Upper Danube, when it kind of curves and it moves into the Carpathian Mountains, and he says that was one of the landing grounds of some people from the Caucasus or the steppe who arrived, who thereafter spread to the rest of Europe, and he says they founded the Italic and Celtic and branches of Indo-European. But he's not saying that is their origin. He's saying that was one of their staging grounds into Europe, whether they came from the steppe or from the Caucasus. And his evidence has to do with the spread of weaponry. And if I can, since I hope I'm not getting too detailed, if you don't mind. But
you've got the quote, then go ahead. Yeah,
it's not a quote. It's just very briefly the argument that he's making. The innovation is, a lot of people look. How do you trace where the Indo-Europeans are from and how they went? Or they look at pottery before. Now they're looking at genetics. Some, or they look at this. He's saying this was very obviously, conspicuously a warrior culture. Why don't you look at the spread of weapons? And so that's what he does. And if you look at the spread of the sword and its development, the earliest samples are from there, and you can see it develop into Northern Europe, Northern Germany, and Italy, and so on, Northern Italy. Say what you will, it's a novel way of thinking about this. I can see you're skeptical.
I have some points to make. I mean, the last person I interviewed for Jive Talk before you was a Bronze Age swordsmith, and we specifically talked about the development of the sword and to what extent the different swords, like, because you could see, like, first daggers, like Copper Age daggers start, and then they get bigger and bigger to dirks and rapiers, and then finally swords. Once one smith has figured out a way to make the bronze longer, then it spreads because other smiths will take it up because that's their craft. So you don't need to have racial, like, because blacksmithing at the time, the Bronze Age necessitated large distance trade networks because of the nature of the alloys. To make this alloy, you needed Cornish tin and copper from the mountains elsewhere, whatever. But that meant that bronze smiths were like having to know about what the latest techniques are and how to get longer blades, stronger blades, etc. So it's not a very good way of measuring weapons in general. Like in any time, I don't think are the greatest way for measuring the arrival of migratory peoples and cultures, because of the fact that although they can try to stop their enemies getting hold of that weaponry, and will try,
Yes.
They won't be successful forever. It's only a matter of time before your enemy takes up the weapon too, because they, for their survival. It's just the same story of war today, right? It's how everyone
Yes.
wants nukes. So, but yeah,
Can I answer that, or should we get into a mini debate, Tom, or no?
yeah. Oh well, let's go ahead if you'd like to. But yeah,
Well, my answer to that is again, I'm repeating the evidence from Drews. It isn't just that it spread. You are absolutely right. For example, the horse technology, when it appears, the bits and later the stirrup, they appear in one place in the steppe, and then just a few hundred years later, they're used everywhere from China to the Near East. Of course, people copy that. But in this particular case, Europe, before, let's say, 1500 BC, there is no evidence of combat weapons used. And then when they appear, it's not just like, a sword model appears. When they appear in these areas, so let's say the Carpathians around 1400 BC or so, 1500 BC, the proto sword that was later used everywhere and probably did spread the way you're saying eventually everywhere. But it appears there, and then other models appear in North Germany and North Italy and so on. But they don't appear by themselves. They appear with a whole toolkit of other things, including chariots, armor, long spear, like a whole thing, and evidence of occasionally destruction of local sites. And so he's making the point that they couldn't just have appeared on their own. They appeared as obviously part of a class that knew how to use them and that took over the local population. And yeah.
Well, there's no doubt
anyway,
that there were major technological developments in the 2nd century BC, and like chariots, dissemination of chariots and swords are a part of that. But I think that like weapons of war, saying that, I don't know if that you're quoting him verbatim, but to say weapons of war begin with the sword, like they're already, like I've had made like about 4,000-year-old like early British weapon, which is, it's not a sword because it's too short, but it's a very long dagger, like bigger than my head.
But
stabbing people to death. It's not for anything else. But yeah.
He would disagree with that. There are such things from before made of copper, but they're not really
bronze. Like, but they're just not long enough to be swords. But
some of them are too long. Some of these dirks and rapiers, and they would have been ceremonial. But you are right that the sword isn't the first one. It's the spear.
Yes.
But combat spears don't really exist before 2100, 2200 BC or so. Anyway, so.
But as you know as well, even going back to before metal, like there are like massacre sites and stuff. So there was some like.
There was violence.
See, like the way that the Papuan like tribes today, like still, like they sometimes get together and have a bit of a war, kill a few of each other. Some of it is like not proper combat because they just sort of shake their weapons around and look aggressive rather than actually killing each other. But a few people die, and I think war is much older than the Middle Bronze Age.
There is, violence is, but what we understand by combat of military groups of young men fighting, that I don't think is, and I'm willing to change my views if further archaeology come about. But I was just talking today with a friend. The earliest very clear evidence of organized warfare is only about 2200 BC in Abashevo in the north steppe. And there you actually have for the first time a burial ground of several hundred young men who had combat spears, I don't know if shields, but armor and so on. It is obviously a very warlike place. Before that, of course, you've always had violence, no doubt, but it was massacres, like skirmishes, massacres of unarmed villagers and so on. It wasn't the same thing that we have in mind when we talk about a warrior class.
I just want to give some context for the listeners who aren't like up to scratch on all the things we're talking about. Abashevo is a derivative of Yamnaya. And earlier we were talking about catacomb culture near the Caucasus. That's also a derivative of Yamnaya. Yes. And the Yamnaya, for those who aren't aware, is one of the archaeological culture that's most popularly associated with the Proto-Indo-European language at the moment.
Yes.
But the Yamnaya themselves had limited weaponry, and there's a debate about the extent to which they employed equestrianism. Some people think not at all. and others, and we're a camp which I think Drew's is in that camp, but I'm in the camp that thinks that the Yamnaya did have equestrianism, and there's some evidence for that. But maybe we should not dwell on it too much, because without everyone being familiar with the papers we're talking about, it isn't very easy for them to follow our arguments.
It's very interesting. I don't know if you want to get into this. The bigger question of what you touched on, and I don't mean to derail conversation. Feel free to change subject if this doesn't interest you. But you mentioned migration of peoples. And I am very concerned by what's happening in genetic studies with people like Joseph Lazaridis and these others who are basically ethnic activists. And I think I will write longer on this and try to make the case. I think they're perpetrating a fraud. For example, they recently had a paper that in the Mediterranean Phoenician cities don't have noticeable, or maybe very small, but don't have noticeable Levantine ancestry. And they just presented that kind of without explanation. And I think what's been going on in Reich labs, especially, which I'll get to, they have a commitment to, if somebody happened to live in the port of Carthage, whoever it may have been, and they find the bones, they say that person is as much a Carthaginian as, let's say, one of the founding families that ruled the city. And a lot of the time, these bones are collected. And when you read the studies, you cannot find the provenance of the bones. In other words, they may know them, but sometimes I think they even delete the provenance. They don't talk about that. You as a reader, even if you're with access to the raw data, cannot find sometimes where the bones are from. Are they from one of the ruling families? Were they found in a mass grave by the port? Were they, let's say, local migrant laborers from nearby regions? You don't know. And my model, Tom, for how ancient history happened is that full-scale migration of peoples was extremely rare, and that almost all historical change that you see was done by small, mobile, highly organized groups. And so what's going on with these studies, especially in the Mediterranean, where you have people like Nassim Taleb and Lazaridis, who aren't necessarily, let's say, Lebanese or Greek nationalists, but more like Mediterranean nationalists.
Pan-Mediterranean chauvinists, I call them.
Yes.
Pan-Mediterranean chauvinists. Yeah.
Exactly. And they're finding evidence of a kind of homogeneity and continuity among the bones of the Mediterranean, which I never denied this. But they're basically taking bones of local Mediterranean peoples, but they're not what we know today from studying history. The Greek upper class, the Punic upper class, and so forth are the ones who did the history that we're studying today. And that study about them being unable by modern methods to find Punic or Levantine ancestry to the known Phoenician cities should be a big red flag to people that there's something seriously wrong with how genetic studies about antiquity are done today. It's like, who will you believe?
It makes a good point, but and I'm no fan. I have my own criticisms of Lazaridis as well, which I go very against his Southern Arc theory and things like that. But to steelman their case, that paper I didn't read it in detail. But usually the papers themselves don't talk about the context of the samples a lot. But then if you read the supplements, they'll have in there a detailed description of the archaeological context of the samples that are used in the study. So that you can find them out, but then they usually don't always get put in the articles that Scientific American do on the findings or whatever.
I have access to the raw, and they don't. I'm telling you, sometimes they do. Sometimes they say this is from a royal grave and so on. And when the samples don't fit their expectations, they sweep them under the rug. But many times you can't find that information. And it's unbelievable to me that they talk about Greek burials and mass graves when we know that they practiced cremation, which you can't do studies on. The upper class did. So that's just one small example. Look, my main point, since we're talking about history in the broad terms, without boring your audience about these details, we can debate later. why is the conquest of why are the conquests of the I call them the Aryans, call them Indo-Europeans, whatever you want. Why are they so interesting? Similarly, why is the settlement of the Phoenicians around the Mediterranean so interesting? It shows history in action. It's done in a planned way by small groups who know exactly where they're going. They have the latest technology, the latest military tactics, and so on. They have a plan. And I think that is how a lot of these things happen. The Norman conquests or the conquests of South America by the Spanish, I think are a good parallel. I think that's how these ancient what we see now.
You're talking about an elite dominance model.
Yes, an elite dominance.
Yeah,
yes,
that's the Norman model is an elite dominance. So you have a small number of men taking over a large civilization, and then implanting themselves as the rulers of it.
Yes, I believe this is how ancient history took place in overall, including, well, we can get into what happened in the Levant and so on, but I think this is how it happened. And if you don't at least have this, like, you know about this model, if you don't at least have this model to be able to argue against it, and these genetics labs rule it out completely. They do not want to consider this possibility at all, They want to talk about migration of peoples for which there's often almost no archaeological evidence. For example, that the Philistines migrated to Canaan and so on. There's no evidence.
But I would say to counter that, I'd say that in the case of Anglo-Saxon England, for example, among like leftists and like general like academics of the last few decades, the elite dominance model was by far preferred as being more politically correct than a racial replacement, because they would like to have thought of the Anglo-Saxon invasion as being like the Norman invasion, where a few Germanic-speaking elites took over it and forced their language on a Brythonic population. But because that to them is less problematic than that an entire people came and just replaced another people. And they even denied that sort of thing happened. But I think that thing did happen. I think both of those two models happened. So that's why I don't think you can say whether in any individual circumstance in history, whether it was an Anglo-Saxon or a Norman-style takeover. But both are possibilities in each case. So you have to go and look at the details of each specific events. I think that like the Indo-European languages spread in diverse ways in different places, and some of those involve Anglo-Saxon style replacements, and others only involve Norman style elite takeovers. But you'd have to look at the details. But going back to the Phoenicians, I'm just curious, like your objection to it, because what they found is that they say that a lot of the people in this Phoenician contexts were actually genetically more like Sicilians or like other Mediterranean peoples, with whom you would expect there to be lots of Phoenician contact anyway, because Sicily had Phoenician colonies on it, and it's not that it's a boat trip away, and people were on their boats a lot in those days. So, do you think it's just like a gradual absorption of other Mediterranean people into the Phoenician colonies of Carthage that would not make them just sort of look like Southern Europeans over time?
No, I think that's perfectly plausible. I have no problem with that. But when you look at the abstract of that study and the way people are interpreting it, and also some of their conclusions, for example, the model you just spoke of right now, I would agree with. At some point in antiquity, Phoenician men, probably small groups, started to form trade emporia. It developed into cities. Probably they kept up with the home cities in the Levant. Maybe they brought wives. This happens. I know you know about this in Spain. There are English families who make wine in Spain and Portugal, who they get their education in England. They get their wives back in England. I think certainly Greek colonization took place this way. For example, Mother City was overpopulated, so they sent a lot of young men. But at their core, there were families. There were Greek families. The families formed the local aristocracy, whereas the many young men married local women, let's say in Sicilian women, and that ended up forming the people of the city. And over time, you would expect there to be interbreeding among the aristocracy and the middle classes and so on. So the original stock would get diluted and so on. I have no problem with that. That's probably the way this colonization took place. But that isn't what they're saying in this paper. They're just presenting it as if and so it's basically
Like Phoenician was a vibe rather than a people or something.
Yes, what's being forgotten is that there was a core population that was foundational, at least at some point.
Well, I think that if they're denying that, that's outrageous, because of course they couldn't possibly be a Phoenician a Semitic language spoken by these people unless there had been a Semitic people founding that cultural, like that colony initially. But that I didn't do a detailed reading of the paper, but my understanding was it was just showing that they had absorbed the people who they colonized to the extent that there wasn't a discernibly notable amount of the original stock in the samples that they had.
Well, take the Greek or Roman case of that, because their intentions become clearer when you look at what they say about that. Mm-hmm. I think the Greek or Roman case is very much like this. There was an Indo-European core, which we spoke about this before. It's not exactly what the Nordicists claim. They were not like modern North Germans or whatever. It's rather they had more of that. A component that was also a third component that was also later foundational to that, but it was different. The point, it was different from the mass of the local population, and that's what these people are denying. They look and they say, "Oh no, there's a perfect continuity between Mycenaean Greeks and modern Greeks. Don't even think about whether there was a core that was foundational that was different from that, And in Rome, the same. It's absurd."
Yes, I get very strange comments from someone saying it's Nordicist for me to point out that the step signal in Greece comes from the people with higher amounts of step than it is in the Greek samples. That's obvious, because it has to be introduced by that component of their ancestry must have been introduced by the source of that component. It's not. I don't know how that's Nordicism, but certainly the bell beakers.
Sorry, go on.
I was saying in Italy as well with the bell beakers, like I often see like people reluctant to talk about, well, the bell beakers would have just been Central Europeans. Like if the bell beaker source of Indo-European languages in the Italian peninsula, then we know bell beakers were just coming from Central Europe. That means that the source of Italic languages was a Central European people. So you're talking like Austrian-like or South German-like people. But is that Nordicist to say that? It's just a fact. It has to be a fact. But
it's a fact, and of course it's not Nordicist, because we spoke about this before. The Nordic peoples as they exist now are also from that, but in a different way.
Yes.
But just I was going to go on. I was getting excited about this stupidity of these Mediterranean nationalists. It's the pettiest kind of example of what we've been talking about on this show, with the reverence for history and kind of petty ethnic nationalism. I just want to give you what I think is kind of the context of this. It's the same kind of people who say that modern Greek is pronounced exactly the same way that ancient Greek was. Yeah. And they chimp out at you if you try to reconstruct ancient Greek pronunciation. It's obviously absurd. Like, there's no evidence. All the evidence is preponderantly in the other direction. But no. With perfect continuity, there's nothing changed. And it's the same people who, sensitive subject, but there's one of these Greek nationalists recently wrote a book about how, the ancient Greeks never practiced anything that looks like homosexuality. It's all made up by evil German and English modern historians who have an agenda, and absolutely they were just like modern Greeks, and they were,
You get an idea of Lazaridis' headspace, or how he thinks. If I tell you, he recently posted a sort of imaginary dialogue fanfic between Athena and Lord Elgin about the marbles.
Oh, God.
And like she's trying to convince him to return them or something. It's
yes.
Yeah.
What do you make of that? The Elgin marbles debate.
I have Greek friends. I like Greek. I understand the argument that they should be returned there, and on the basis of just like that's the original home of the creations, and people made that argument in the 18th century as well. And it's not a bad argument. They're not actually intending to return them to the Parthenon. They're going to put them in a museum at the bottom of the Acropolis, so they still won't be in the original context in Greece. But like the point, my objection is that there's any kind of indication that Britain stole them or that Britain owes them to anyone, because Britain did Greece and the world a service by looking after them, and we ought to be thanked for the start. And if they wanted to buy them back, they should come humbly and a
Yes.
request to do so, that would be fine, and I wouldn't object to them being sold to the Greeks, even if it was at a loss. It's not about the money; it's about being respectful. But the accusation that they were stolen is a lie, and that we have any duty to give them back. That's just not true. So I think it's all been framed in this post-colonial, like, a leftist way, which is just a fiction. That's my main objection to it. And it starts off with Maria Mercuri, the feminist 1970s feminist socialist politician who started all this in Greece. And that's why I think it's got that association, really.
Well, it's disgusting. It's the same thing with the Rosetta Stone, right? The only way we have decipherment of hieroglyphs is because of work done by someone who tagged along with Napoleon and so on. And it's the work of English, French, Dutch, German, West European archaeologists, aesthetes, appreciators of art and antiquity, that things like the Elgin marbles and so on were saved from possible destruction or defilement. I have no sympathy to this. We call it third worldism now, but it's exactly this intersection of leftism, anti-colonialism, plus petty ethnic nationalism of these marginal peoples who themselves really, until recent times, had no appreciation or knowledge or interest in their own history. There's a wonderful aside in Schopenhauer where he says it's often the case that a masterwork, a painting, is found in the servants' quarters, just neglected with no, and some aesthete finds it, and most people would not respect it if they were not told that it's important or beautiful. And overall, that's just the history of beautiful ancient artifacts in the world. I'm not saying it's impossible. Yeah, it's not impossible for others to come to appreciate it, but at least until recent times, you're totally right. It's the world owes so much to. I'm an Anglophile on this, as on so many other things. The world owes so much to English and French archaeologists and explorers for this kind of thing,
And German too, yeah. Those three. And there was something similar. Stone Age herbalist, when he was active, was talking about the African, like the bronzes and sculptures from West Africa, where like they were just going to get melted down. A lot of them, they weren't valued. British people bought them, put them in museums. Then when Africans figured out that they were actually valuable, then they wanted them back again. Some of them were given back, and then they were immediately lost because they were sold off again to get money. Like, so they don't have the same sense of custodianism, like this idea that the Anglos developed and other Western European nations have, that like we are looking after the heritage of mankind. It comes from that thing we were talking about earlier, like the idea that like the English weren't like hoarding these just for a national chauvinism, like we've got this stuff because we're English. They kind of sense themselves as being like the shepherds of mankind, or like inheriting this like duty to look, the white man's burden, as Kipling called it, which is sort of absent now because it's seen as problematic. But it was an interesting thing, and I think that sense of self-worth and like purpose is what enabled the English to achieve what they had. They did, but they don't have it anymore, so it's not possible now.
Can I give another especially disgusting example of this attitude that touches on so many things we've just spoken about? In Australia, I think in Kimberley region, there's the Bradshaw figures, I think they're called. Some are dated back to 60,000 years ago. That's disputed, but that's
incredibly old. If wow.
That's disputed, but some people say that they're in any case tens of thousands of years old. They show humanoid figures that do not look anything like the Aborigines who live there now. And prior to European, let's say, it's well known that until very recently, the local Aborigines said these are from before our time. They are made by birds, actually, and we're going to scratch them out. And they try to scratch them out all the time previously. Now, however, because attention has come on this, they've been taught to say, "Oh no, we made these," and when you look up what the scratching out means, they say, "Oh no, we were improving them." It's like me going to an ancient painting and like chipping at it, and then when I'm asked what I'm doing with this vandalism, I'm improving on, I'm adding heritage to it, right? But they were obviously trying to scratch out, I think, evidence of a previous people that had been there who they didn't understand and hated, and now they said, no, it is ours, and this was us, by the way. The worst kind the worst kind of third worldist ethnic nationalism, anti-colonialism, used simply to clobber the heads of West Europeans, who are the only preservers of the rich heritage of mankind in recent centuries.
Yeah, it's very clear to me from the examples we just discussed how ethnocentrism and ethnic feeling can actually become an obstruction to the learning about and preserving the heritage of even your own ethnicity, let alone mankind in general. But I think also, and this is an argument I have to make against mainstream academics, yes. I think it can be a good thing as well, because the audience I find is mostly laymen, and they want to they connect with history through a sense of pride. So I do think that harnessing the general sense of pride and in one's history and the dignity that a knowledge of your history affords you is a good way for generating the general public interest in history that can help to generate revenue as well. So sure. I mean, what do you think about because you have mixed feelings about ethnocentrism? Do you think it could be helpful as well?
Yes, I think it can obviously be helpful, but in a lot of these third world cases, it's a very recent creation, right? I mean, what the hell is Pakistani nationalism? It's a completely made-up country. I think the name comes from an acronym, right? The only thing holding together those ethnicities is Islam, which is why they are so adamant about that. And their whole self-conception is oppositional to the West. And that's, I think, even the case in countries with genuine ancient histories like India and China. And so, it's whose ethnocentrism. I obviously think West Europeans could use a healthy dose of extra ethnic feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. It's still quite strong in Greece, but it also hasn't stopped there being a very leftist sort of culture in Greece. And also, that you see these tourists go home and refugees welcome graffiti and stuff in Greece. Cool. So if any kind of ethnocentrism is not explicitly attached or detached from third worldism, then it doesn't really have much positive influence.
Well, I have a lot of contempt for that kind of petty thing where the Greeks say you cannot call Turkish coffee Turkish, and Turks have their own stupid arguments about, and then Armenians say you can't. So if you go to the joke is right, the Quora board, the Quora forums, where you get an Albanian, a Bulgarian arguing for 20,000 pages about who owns some valley. I mean,
I enjoy Balkan arguments on the internet.
Yes.
I want to go back on the subject of the internet to sort of wrap up our conversation to what you said at the beginning, that you made a comment that I thought was quite interesting. I'd like you to elaborate on. You said that before 2010, there wasn't such this interest in ancient history. You couldn't find it, or you wouldn't encounter people talking about it. What do you think is it about the world since 2010 and the online culture that's developed that has renewed this fascination for the deep past?
Yes. Well, I ought to clarify. I meant specifically what today would be recognized as hard right or far right. I don't like these words, or dissident, whatever. Let's just call it the faction of truth, which includes an appreciation, a vital interest in antiquity and so on. That before 2010 in real life, for me, was I couldn't meet people in real life who I could talk to. So I met some online on forums before 2010. But something started to change around 2010 to 2012. And I think it was the acceleration of the leftist program, maybe. Now, leftism, wokeism, call it whatever you want, had been around at least since the early 90s, but even before. But it really accelerated, especially with the start of Obama's second term. They went so crazy. And then in Europe, it went so crazy, especially around then with, what Merkel did in 2015, busting open the borders and everything going insane. Before that, there were the protests in France around gay marriage in 2013, which, yes, and really those turned into protests against mass migration by the youth involved in that, which was a wonderful development. Dominic Venner, the great historian, committed suicide around 2013. Excuse me. So around that time, something happened, which I think was the overreach by the left, maybe, where young people around the world went online. Many had already been partly on forums like 4chan, but other things to discuss forbidden knowledge, which includes this fascination with aspects of antiquity. That would be my guess of what changed. This acceleration.
I think so.
Spread since then.
Yeah, because also in a way, like in Britain and I think other parts of the West, there's like a very deep focus on the Second World War as a year zero. So even just like having an active interest in anything before that, whether it was the French Revolution or the fall of Rome, had become sort of right-wing coded, even though academia for all these niche subjects was still deeply left-wing.
Yes, I think I don't know what will happen next, but things have certainly accelerated change since 2015. Where I like to give the example of authors like Celine and Ernst Junger and Mishima. I didn't know anybody who was reading them before then. I remember mentioning it to some professor that I like them, and Arab man touch your thigh. He leaned over, put his hand on my thigh. He whispered, "I noticed you like some of the more reactionary authors." And then he patted my back. He's like, "That's okay. That's fine." It wasn't seen as especially harmful, but it was seen as extremely odd that you would be reading them. Now, so many young people are reading them. I think the same reasons you just spoke about. Yeah.
I remember during my postgraduate degree in history, I had the course in English. Because I was studying Middle English and stuff, we had a lecture on like modern influences from Old and Middle English, which had shared with English literature graduates and undergrads, and they did a lecture on Ezra Pound, and they asked like a room full of like 50 students, like, who here reads Ezra Pound? And I'm the only hand that went up. Yeah, that was it, 2011. I think it was like, I don't know if it would be any different now if they went into the room, because I think most of the people who go and study literature at university are still quite clueless about that.
I would imagine it would be the same in a university libtard setting. Unfortunately, Tom, I think it would be the same broadly online too. The people who actually read Ezra Pound, Celine, have a vital interest in ancient history are about the same number maybe as in 2015-16. I am very skeptical of the recent popularization of these kinds of ideas on X and such,
Yeah, everyone knows that right-wing people on the internet like to pretend to have read books they haven't read. But I read Celine myself in the noughties when I was in my early 20s. I think that's the time to read him, because maybe I should reread him now. I'm middle-aged, but I think it was like that energy and vitality of it was very appealing to me as a young man. I think, maybe.
I highly recommend, if you read, don't just read Journey to End of the Night, read his book Death on Credit and ask your audience to read it too. It's one of the most cynical, darkest books, again, by a man widely recognized as hard right or whatever, but he is completely cynical about all modern ideas, all modern pieties. He thinks all modern pieties have to be thrown into the trash, and only those that make the gauntlet of humor and cynicism and come out the other side deserve to survive,
Yes, I believe I compared you to him in the first review I did of your book, because it's not what people might think right-wing literature, because I wouldn't call Celine was right-wing in the sense that I think he was a fascist sympathizer, but his literature doesn't feel like what people might think right-wing literature would be like. It's coarse and vulgar at times, and I mean, he dregs up the muddy bottoms to find gems, if you will, like sort of thing you kind of do. Like you don't shy away from like the popular vulgarity of the time and use the internet slang to sort of get your point across. But yeah, I definitely think, especially younger audience members who likes, something a little bit rough and like that kind of thing, like definitely read Celine, Death on Credit or Eternity and the Night. I read both, but I can't remember which one's which in my memory because they're so long ago. One of them, he goes on a boat to New York and he comments that they talk to each other while pissing, and he finds that strange.
Yes, well, all kinds of sorry, go on.
Is that Death on Credit or Journey to the End of the Night? He's a doctor in America.
I think that maybe Journey. He started to be doctor in Africa, but it's bizarre. Yes, it's kind of the plot is loose and not especially engaging, but the general story reads like a whirlwind, reads very fast. So yeah,
he reminds me of the Beats in that sense, but I prefer him. But yeah, this has been an interesting discussion, and I thank you very much for joining me today. Bap, it's a pleasure. I'd like to continue our conversation another time on my podcast or yours.
Anytime, Tom. Please come on Caribbean Rhythm soon.
I will do. That would be great. Thanks a lot.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Goodbye. Are you interested in worshipping the gods of ancient England and Scandinavia, but you're not sure how to do it? Starting Heathenry is a ritual-focused online course which will furnish you with the knowledge and confidence to practice the heathen religion, alone or with others. The course teaches you how to construct heathen prayers for yourself, not according to the established rites of any modern group, but according to what historical sources show. Starting Heathenry assumes you're interested in Germanic paganism, know about the gods and myths, and want to begin practicing this religion, but require guidance on how to do so. It is based on a micro-learning structure, which is proven to improve knowledge retention by up to 80% in students compared to other learning methods. You get more than 5 hours of learning material, bit by bit, as you please. A modern method of learning about an ancient religion. Your path to knowing the gods through ritual starts here.